Hey, it's your bro here. Hope you're doing well. And in this video, I'm going to teach you how to create a form using HTML. Let's get into it. The form element is used to collect user input from a visitor to your site. This can be anything from personal information to surveys, payment info, etc. There are different form input elements such as text fields, radio buttons, drop-down lists, checkboxes, and there's even a form element for a submit button, just like we covered in the last video. So let's get started. The first thing that we're going to do is use a pair of form tags. So we need an opening form tag and a closing form tag. Usually on an HTML form, there's an action attribute that you may find within the opening form tag, and this defines the action to be performed when the form is submitted. The data from the form may be sent to a page on the server when the user clicks on some sort of submit button. There might be a PHP file or some other script within the action attribute that the form sends data to. It might be a file such as do underscore something dot php, or it might be named something like action page, something or other, but I like do something.php. So we won't be doing much with the action attribute in this lesson, but we might cover it in a different tutorial. Okay, let's create a text box for somebody to enter in their first name. Let's create a prompt or a label that says first name, and let's see what this looks like. All right, so then what I'm going to do then is that we're going to use the input tag, and this is a self-closing tag, and we're going to use the type attribute and set this to text. So this will place a text box when we use the type text attribute and set this to text. Now, there's one trick, and it's called using a label. So sometimes people might have difficulty with clicking on the text box. So one thing that we can do is that with our label, well, text that is functioning as a label, there's actually a label tag that has some benefits. So what we're going to do is take our first name and surround this with a pair of label tags. And I'll show you what this does in just a moment. All right, so then what we're going to do is in the opening label tag, we're going to type for equals, and then we need to come up with an ID for our input. And we could say something such as first underscore name. Now we'll want to create an ID for this text box, and we'll have it match whatever we placed for the for attribute. So first underscore name. So this label and this text box are now linked, but you have to make sure that these have the same name. So this ID has to match whatever the for label has. And an added benefit of this is that if we click on first name, it's going to place our cursor within the text box. So that's kind of a nice feature too. The ID attribute is the client-side identifier mostly used for CSS and JavaScript to uniquely identify this specific element. And there's also another attribute called name. So let's create that here. And with the name, a common practice is to set the ID and the name to be the same. So I'm going to type in first underscore name. So the name attribute is used during form submission to post or get the values that we submit when we hit some sort of submit button. So this is only used when we're using a server-side language such as PHP or a few other languages out there. While the ID and the name attributes really aren't required for this tutorial, it would be good practice just to become familiar with them as you advance your skills. Then you know what these things are then. Well, now we have a text box where we can enter in our first name. So let's do the same thing for a last name. And honestly, I'm just going to add a few line breaks, and then we can copy and paste this. And we can change a few things. So we're going to change any instance of first name to last name. So last name, and we'll change the ID to last name and the name to last name. Let's save, reload, and we now have a box for a last name. Now with these text boxes, we can add a placeholder if we want to let the user know what kind of format that we want them to enter their user input in. So for example, let's use the placeholder attribute, and we can set this equal to some default value, and the text that's going to appear within the text box is going to be like gray and faded. So let's come up with a first name. I like the name SpongeBob, and then let's do the same thing for the last name input box, and I will pick a last name of SquarePants, but you don't have to pick the same thing I do. You could always pick like John Smith or something. I just want this to be entertaining. All right, so then within the text box, it says SpongeBob SquarePants. It's like some sample text, and if we were to click on this text box and enter something in, this would actually disappear until we clear out the text box. Then it goes back to our sample text. So this is useful if you want to let the user know what kind of format that we want them to enter their information in. So it's useful for like phone numbers or email addresses, stuff like that. Let's create a few buttons. Does that sound good? But I'll add a few line breaks. So there's another option to create buttons on a form, and that's by setting the type attribute of the input element to either reset if you want a reset button or submit if you want a submit button. So let's create an input element, and we're going to use the type attribute and set this to reset. Let's save, reload. We now have a reset button. So let's type in some text. So I'll make up a first name and a last name. So if we were to hit this reset button, it's actually going to clear out this form for us, which is pretty sweet. Let's do the same thing and create a submit button. So I'll add a few line breaks. We'll use the input element, and we'll set the type equal to submit. Let's save, reload. We now have a submit button. So with the submit button, if we were to click on this HTML file is going to send the information from this form to whatever page is listed within the action attribute of your opening form element. So you might have some sort of file here like do something.php or some other action page. So let's refresh this and actually attempt to send some information and see what happens. So I'm just going to send a first name and a last name and hit submit. So this is going to attempt to send this information to this page on the server, but we don't currently have anything set up though. But that's how you would actually submit information from a form. So that's the basics of forms. If you want to continue, I'll show you a few other different input methods for forms, and I've already went ahead and made a few labels for stuff that might be related to form submission, such as like a title, payment type, email, birthdays, phone numbers, passwords, stuff like that. So if you're interested, let's begin. I'll include timestamps in the description if there's anything or any type of input that you'd be interested in. Let's begin by creating some radio buttons for a title, and by title I mean like Mr., Mrs., Doctor, titles like that. So let's create a few labels to begin. So label for equals, and then perhaps the first one will be Mr. Then let's add some text to the screen, so we'll just put the text Mr. on here, and then close this label. Then we'll copy this and paste it a few times, perhaps 4. And we'll make the second label for Mrs., the third one for Miss, and then we got to change the text to, and PhD. And we can probably stop there, even though there's many more titles. PhD. Let's save this, reload. All right. So we want to add a radio button after each of these options. So we're going to be adding an input element after each of these specific labels. So let's begin with Mr. So we're going to set the type equal to radio for radio button. We're going to set the value equal to Mr. And then we want to set the ID equal to whatever we have within the for attribute so it matches. So Mr. as well. So there's one other attribute that we want to add, and it's that name attribute. But first, I want to show you what happens if we don't have the name attribute set up. So we're going to be adding that in just a moment. So what I'm going to do is copy this and paste it underneath each of these specific labels, and we'll make a few changes. So we have the Mr. radio button set up. So let's do the same thing for Mrs. We're just going to be editing some of these fields. We need Miss and PhD. Okay, let's save this, reload the page, and we now have a radio button after each of these titles, but take a look to see what happens if we select more than one. We can actually select all of these, And with radio buttons for each group, you only want to be able to select one of these. Selecting one will deactivate any others. So we need to add a name attribute, and each group of radio buttons needs to have the same name. So I will give this name, perhaps title. So I'll copy this and paste this name attribute into each of these input elements so they each have the same name, so they're all within the same group. So let's save this, reload, and when we select a radio button, it actually deselects any others that are selected, so we can only select one then. Let's move on to drop-down menus, and this would be perfect for some sort of payment where we can click a drop-down menu and select a payment type. So I already created a payment label. So the first thing we're going to do is use the select tag, and we're going to set the ID equal to perhaps payment. And then we need to set some options, but we also need a closing select tag, and all the different items within the drop-down menu are going to be within these pair of select tags, and we have to add options. So we're going to have an opening option tag and a closing option tag for each of these available options. So for the first value, we'll use the value attribute and set this perhaps to Visa, like you can pay with the Visa credit card. And let's add some text. So we'll just say Visa. So let's save this, reload the page, and we now have a drop-down menu, but it only has one option, so we want to add a few others. So I'm going to copy this, paste it a few times, and change a few things. 4 is a good amount. Perhaps the second value can be a MasterCard. And we'll change the text as well. And then for the third option, perhaps a gift card. So make sure to change it within the value attribute and the text as well. Gift card. And lastly, perhaps a check. So change the value and the text. Let's save, reload, and we now have a drop-down menu with a few options, and we can select one of these for our payment. Let's create an email field. So we're going to use the input element, and we're going to set the type equal to email, the ID equal to email, and the name equal to email. Let's save, reload the page, and we now have a field where we can enter in our email. We can also place a placeholder as well. So we'll use the placeholder attribute and set this equal to some default text that will display within here. So for our default text, our placeholder for our first name and last name, it was SpongeBob SquarePants. So perhaps I'll make a false or fake email address based off of that. So S SquarePants at uses gmail.com. Let's save, reload the page. Now somebody can enter in their email. If we attempted to write in an email that didn't contain the @ sign, this would actually yell at us then. So I'll just type in the word fake.com and we'll attempt to submit this. And we have this little warning message that says, please include an @ sign in the email address. So let's actually add the @ sign, and I'll just make up a fake email. So fake@gmail.com, and then only then can we actually submit this form to have some sort of server page process this information. So that's a way of error checking. If you have an email field set up, it will actually prompt the user to enter in a valid email that has that @ sign, which is pretty cool. Let's cover the date input type, and this would work perfect for a birthday or birth date. So after our label for birthday, we're going to use the input element and set the type equal to date, the ID equal to birthday, and the name also equal to birthday. Let's save, reload the page, and we now have this input element for like a year, month, and day. There's also a drop-down menu too if you want to select something as well. And you can also add a minimum or maximum value to the dates you can select. For example, let's say that we want to limit the latest date that we can select. So we'll use the min attribute and set this equal to perhaps January 1st, 2000. So 2001-01. So let's save this, reload, and we can only go so far back now. all the way to the year 2000. So that's the latest date. So you can keep that in or take it out if you want, but you have options based on what you want to do. With the number type, this would be perfect if you're setting up some sort of online shop and you need to select a quantity, like how many of something do you want to buy? How many t-shirts do you want to buy? So we can set a quantity. So we'll use the input element, set the type equal to number, and we want our ID to match our for attribute, so quantity, and we'll need to set a name, and we'll set this equal to quantity. Let's save, reload, and we now have an input box for an amount, but there's really no limit on here. Like we can buy like these many of something, and a user could also buy a negative amount of something. Like, for example, they could buy negative 10 t-shirts and you'd probably end up giving them money or something. So you'd probably want to limit the quantity. So in order to do that, within the input element, we're going to use the min attribute and set this equal to perhaps 0. Like they want to buy 0 for the minimum amount. And maybe max, we can set this equal to maybe 99. So let's save, reload the page, and we cannot go below 0, nor can we type in a number bigger than 99 and successfully submit it. It says value must be less than or equal to 99. So if we were to type in 99, which is actually the max, then submit it, this would work then. You can also set a default quantity, like for example, use the value attribute and set this equal to 1. So by default, you're going to have a quantity of 1 in case somebody's like checking out something in an online shop. They'll end up buying at least one item, but they can increase this if they want. Telephone numbers, we'll use the input element, and we're going to set the type equal to TEL, which is short for telephone. We'll set the ID equal to phone, and the name equal to phone as well. Let's save, reload, and we can now input a phone number. Let's create a password field. So we'll type this in after the password label, input type equals password, the ID equal to pass. I guess password works. I already wrote pass and I don't feel like changing it now. And name also will be pass. Let's save this, reload, and we now have a password field. All the text that we add within here is bulleted, but there's really no limit to the amount of characters we can add to this password, so we can actually limit this. So let's say that we want the max length of the password to be perhaps 12 characters. First, let's just add a note after that lets the user know that max is 12 characters, so max 12 characters. All right, within the input element of our password field, we're going to use the max length attribute, and let's set this equal to 12. Let's save, reload, and let's attempt to type in more than 12 characters. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And that's our limit, so we can't type in anymore. So that's a good way to limit user input for a password field. Hang on, because we're almost finished. We are on the range input data type. So this works like a slider. Think of like the star system when you rate somebody. It's like on a scale. This one isn't as pretty though. You can do some designing with CSS and whatnot, but we're going to use the input element and set the type equal to range. And let's see what this appears like. All right, so we have this sliding scale here, but let's say that we want to add some numbers to this, like maybe a number before this and after this. So we're going to add some text right next to this input type. Let's pretend that we want to rate somebody's service between 1 and 5 stars. So before and after this slider scale, we're going to add 1 before this range, and then 5 after this. So let's save, reload, and we now have a slider bar between a certain range. However, there's perhaps 100 different positions that this slider can be in. So let's say that we want to limit that. We can actually set up some steps. So we'll use the step attribute, and we can set this to some value that is preferably divisible by 100. Let's say that we want 5 different steps. Well, we'll actually put 25 here, and this is the reason why. So each notch or step in this slider bar will actually count as 25, but we always count 0 as well. So if we set the step equal to 25 positions, we'll end up with 5 different stars, 5 different positions. So let's just count this to test it out. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, just like we intended. However, if you made this 20, we would actually end up with 6 different positions then. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Even though 100 different positions divided by 20 is still 5, we always count 0 though with that. And with this range input type, you can also set a default value. So let's set the value equal to 100. So when we reload the page, our rating is already at 5 stars and we can lower this. Otherwise, we can change this to a different number like 50 and it would end up being right in the middle. So you can also place a default value for your sliding scale as well. Checkboxes are very simple, and a perfect example of us using a checkbox would be for some sort of subscribe button. So under my subscribe label, we're going to use the input element again and set the type equal to checkbox. Then the ID equal to subscribe, because that's what I decided the 4 attributes going to be for. And the name also set to subscribe. All right, let's save, reload, and we now have a checkbox next to our subscribe label that we can check on or off. Okay, I promise this is the last one. We can use the file input type to upload a file to a server page. So I have the upload a file label, and we're going to use the input element and set the type equal to file and the ID equal to my file, because I already wrote that, and the name also equal to my file. Let's save, reload. Okay, so we can now click this button to upload a file, and let's click this button, choose file, to upload a file. Okay, well, here's a folder where I'm keeping some related HTML files. Let's say that we want to upload this test Excel file. So we'll click open, and this file is now uploaded. Now, if you want to limit the types, the file extensions of what files you can upload, you can actually use the accept attribute. So we'll say accept, and then we'll place perhaps .txt, like we only want to upload plain text files. So let's try this one more time then. So let's save, reload the page, and I'm going to choose a file again within the same folder. And here we only have that test file now, the plain text file. So before you could see that HTML file and that Excel file, but now we can only upload the file type that we specified, which was plain text. So then we can just upload that, and then, we can submit this then. But yeah, that is pretty much all the basics for using forms in HTML. I'll post all the code that I have in the comments down below. But yeah, those are the basics of forms in HTML. Hey you, if you enjoyed this lesson, then you can help me help you in 3 easy steps by smashing that like button, drop a comment down below, and subscribe if you'd like to become a fellow bro.